I just hate time travel books in general because so many of them fail to meet my expectations. But I'm shocked, but I may have actually found a good, decent time travel book. Hi, I'm Ann. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be reviewing the book When the Day Comes by Gabrielle Meyer. I have a conflicted relationship with time travel books. There was a Romeo and Juliet time travel called Saving Juliet by Suzanne Selfers, which I owned and I loved when I was a teenager, and I read it when I was older, and I absolutely hated it. And that was about this modern girl and guy who were playing Romeo and Juliet on stage, and then they got teleported back in time to actual Romeo and Juliet. There's also a few adaptations where you will have a modern person travel back to the medieval era and probably take advantage of those who live there, as if depicting they're idiots. There is also perhaps a famous recent one that a lot of people know is Outlander, where the girl is from the 1940s and she travels back to 16th century Scotland? 17th century? I think it's 17th century. But there's been a lot of both book and movie adaptations that deal with time travel in recent years. However, for me, a lot of them fail because either they have unsatisfactory conclusions or they tend to make the people from the older era appear dumber than they actually were. However, this book did time travel exceptionally well. So, the book follows Libby, who is a time crosser. Basically, she is born in two eras, and every time she goes to sleep and wakes up, she wakes up in the other time period. So, for example, with her, she is 20 years old in 1774 and 1914. And her mother, who is also a time crosser, she was from the 1750s or whatever, and then she was also from the 1970s. They are born with this little birthmark tattoo, which dictates that they're going to be a time crosser for the first 21 years of their life. And when they turn 21, they have to decide which era they want to stay in. Now, Libby prefers the 1700s. She's just about to get to the American Revolution. She loves her mother very much. Her mother is a time crosser like her, so she understands her. There's this guy she has loved since they were younger, so there's a lot in the era that she loves. However, in 1914, there's not that much goodness in her life. Her mother is very manipulative, conniving. She is an American heiress, so she comes from a wealthy family, and her mother wants to marry her off to a titled lord in England. And so Libby is very unhappy in the 1914 era, and she is, like I said, 20 years old. So in a year, she is going to become 21, and she's going to relinquish the 1914 era and stay in the 1770s. However, that changes. There's a lot to love in this book, and I did not expect it to be the way it was, and I think Meyer describes it very well. It's not supposed to be a time traveling story as much as it is supposed to be two different eras and understanding those eras. Libby has been taught by her mother, her time-crossing mother, that you don't want to affect history. So you want to just sit more in the background. So in the 1770s, she's very much a spectator of the beginnings of the American Revolution. And then in 1914, she's of course witness to knowing that World War I is coming. And so you have those two eras, and she is an observer in those two eras. So for a history major like me, that's already a great idea. Now each chapter switches back and forth. So one chapter will be in 1774, the next chapter will be in 1914, etc., etc. And you'll just go back and forth between those two. I often struggle with these types of books because I find I prefer one of the timelines better than the other. And I thought that was going to be the case in this one because I really like the 1774 timeline and I wasn't a huge fan of the 1914 timeline, but by the end I kind of switched and I preferred the other one more. So it definitely defies your expectations of which timeline you will prefer. The pacing is a little bit slow, and if you don't prefer getting into more of the historical stuff, a lot of the small details of daily life of both eras, you will probably struggle a little bit with the middle of this book. because it does get quite slow. I didn't mind that, but then I also love history, and I also enjoyed learning about the characters. You have a whole different set of characters in each timeline, and each are really interesting. Of course, Libby, like the reader, I feel like her heart is in the 1770s, and by the end, it is more in the 1914s. I feel like very much your heart goes with hers, so she is a really great protagonist because she, in a sense, guides the reader through these two eras. And I was always on her side. Whatever decision she made, I could reasonably understand and agree with her on it. So it was really interesting because oftentimes a lot of characters I don't agree with their decisions, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because I think different kinds of people and different kinds of characters will make different kinds of decisions, and that means they're a good character. A character should not do the right perfect thing all the time. But with her, she is guided by her mother from the 1700s, and she's very much wise beyond her years because of that, because she has had her mother to guide her. There is an overarching theme of Christianity in this book. However, I am not a huge fan of Christian books because I don't find that they weave in Christianity well into the book. They basically just ignore it for most of the book and just like throw it in on random moments like, yeah, you should trust God. But with this one, it's much more nuanced, and it makes sense for both these eras that there would be a more focus on Christianity, because this is 1700, the late 1700s and the early 1900s. Both eras in America were overwhelmingly Christian, so it makes sense for all these characters to be Christian. Now, I want to gush a little bit about spoilers in this book because there are some serious incidences. Now, in the 1914 timeline, Libby is forced to get married to this British, I believe he's a marquis, and she is forced to move from America to England to live in his estate, and he ends up assaulting her on their marriage night when he gets drunk. He ends up doing it again several months later, and she ends up falling pregnant. The problem with this is what happens when you turn 21 as a time crosser and you decide which era you are going to be in, your body dies in that other era. So basically, if she were to choose the 1770s, having a child, that would mean she would kill her child. Her child would die because of her actions. So this is like 6 months. She gets pregnant like 6 months before she is to decide which era she wants to live in. So she is forced to make the horrific choice to stay in the 1910s as opposed to remain in the 1770s. What is even worse is there was this young man in the 1770s that she loved since she was a child. Henry is his name. He's a very interesting character. He is working with the Sons of Liberty. He is very much into the cause of American Revolution. She wants to stay and marry him, especially as about 3/4 of the way into the book, he confesses his love to her, and she confesses her love to him, and there's this like beautiful moment of them realizing that they both have loved each other for years and they never really said it to the other person, and that is all pulled away from her when she learns that she's to have a child in this timeline, and she refuses to kill the child, and even worse, to abandon the child in that era and leave it alone, because for all she knows, it could be a time crosser itself, and then she would leave it to kind of navigate these two eras and come to grapple to terms with what it is, while she had her mother, who was also a time crosser in the 1770s, that helped her navigate that. She learns also that her mother actually wanted to stay in the 1990s, which is the era she came from, and she didn't because she fell pregnant in the 1700s with Libby. And her mother says she never regretted the decision of keeping Libby and staying in that era because of how much she loved her daughter. And so because of that example, Libby wants to give her child a truly happy and healthy childhood. So in the end, she learns in this era that Henry is going to be killed in like right before her 21st birthday in the 1770s timeline, and even though she tries to warn him not to, she fails and he is killed in that timeline. So she crosses over to 1916 at this point, because the book takes place over, I would say, 2 years total. And Libby is now stuck in this era. She's chosen this era, and her husband ends up dying in World War I. He enlists and leaves. So you have her being a very wealthy now widow who is in charge of her future now because her mother no longer has control over her decisions. So you have this like very bittersweet almost ending where I was like, is this how it's going to end? With Libby separated from her mother in this era, from her younger sisters. She has 2 younger sisters who are not time crossers, as well as like learning that she couldn't save the man she loved. And then there's a great moment that she actually travels back to Williamsburg in 1916. It's about a year after or so she made her choice to stay in 1916, and she previously in the book met this congressman who she saw a tattoo just like the one she had on his neck, and she asked him basically, are you a time crosser? And he said yes, he was, from the, I believe, 1500s. Can't remember what he says. So she learns that there are other time crossers out there than her, and in the end she gets introduced to his son, who turns out to be Henry in the 1916. Now it's crazy to imagine that they were like literally in the same 2 timelines, because both her mother and his father were both in like different timelines. Like her mother was from the 1700s and the 1900s. His father was from the 1900s and like the 1500s. So it was interesting that like the coincidences that they were both from these eras. But in his family, it's not 21 that you stop time crossing, it's 25. So he was like 23 in 1974 when she was around. So it was slightly different years, but really interesting how they were close together. So of course, because she's a wealthy widow and of course he is free, they end up getting married and living happily ever after. So there's a great conclusion to the ending. She also learns that her mother in the 1770s timeline, and this is why I was absolutely sobbing at the end, her mother left her a diary, an ode to her daughter, and it was kept for like 300 years about 250 years, and Libby is able to read it and read what happened to her family afterwards. I just loved that ending so much, because even though I did love Libby's relationship with Henry and their romance, and I really enjoyed learning about Libby as an individual, I really loved her relationship with her mother. It was so close and so healthy, and her mother helped her overcome so many difficulties because she was the only one that truly understood her throughout the story, because she had been a time traveler herself. So I loved that conclusion, learning what happened to her mother and how her mother ended up remarrying and having a very happy marriage and living on, like, I think 30 more years. I was like so emotional after finishing this book. It was wonderful. Now, this book was published in May of 2022, and interestingly enough, the very end of the book has Libby give birth to a daughter, but the daughter has 2 of these marks. The same one that Libby has and the same one that Henry has. So they're not sure if she's going to be like a time crosser in like 2 eras or what's going to happen. But I did see on Goodreads that this is actually number 1 of a series, which I did not know that when I read this book. So I'm really excited to have possibly a sequel. I assume it may follow her daughter. I highly recommend this book. I ended up giving this book 5 out of 5 stars. I also shared a picture of this book on Instagram. If you're not following me on Instagram, link is in the description. Please do. But, and she actually, Gabrielle Meyer actually shared my picture and thanked me for my kind words in my review. So yeah, she seems sweet, especially since she's a homeschool mom, which I did not know when I read this book. I went on her Instagram and I was like, oh, she sounds like an awesome person too. She's a good writer and an awesome person. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe. I post every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern time, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!